morning. I'm glad you came by to see our Japanese garden. I say our, but it's really Esther's. She did all the work on it, and so she gets the credit. The garden has been on the so-called Secret Garden Show of Newport now a number of times, and a secret garden in Newport parlance is one that you can't see from the street. But people have been very much interested in coming up to see this one. They have to climb the hill to do it, but they come up because they know that there's a good garden waiting here. This house, we put it behind this house, and this house was built by Captain Brayman about 1815. He was a Newport sea captain, and he presumably was in the Japanese trade at some time. You put together a Newport sea captain with trade with Japan, and you take a romantic young woman of the 1980s and 1970s and 80s, and you just have a natural for a Japanese garden. Esther had made a couple of trips to Japan. She'd seen some of the great ones over there, and we had a little patch of land behind the house that we're going to tell you about, and Esther decided that there was going to be a Japanese garden, and so it is, and we're glad you've come to see it. We've been about 13 years in the house. Of that time, you could say roughly that Esther spent 3 years planning the garden, 5 years building it, and I think it's been almost 5 years that you've had it finished and showed. It's been quite a little period, and it certainly has been one of your principal thought preoccupations all that time. You can see this garage here. It's just a heavy pigeon block garage, a 3-stall garage. And when we moved in, you can see by the fences on each side that there's no way to get behind the garage except to squeeze through the fences. It was a rubble heap back there, and Esther decided that that rubble heap was going to go, and the garden was going to take its place. We did a lot of work on the house, and now we're going to do some work on the grounds. In doing all this work, we engaged an architect, Dick Long, who has been distinguished for his work on restorations here in Newport. And he said about the garage, there are 2 points. One, it's a great massive stone thing lying heavy on the landscape, and it needs a lightening somehow in that mass. Second, he said, if you are going to break through and have a Japanese garden, let us break through with style and use 2 moon gates, which constitute the central approach to it through the garage. So we got the moon gates made by a stonemason from Jamestown who did a beautiful job. They're 7 feet in diameter, those big circles, and he did those 2 arches, and thus we go through to the garden, which, as I say, was a rubble heap, and now you see something that is vastly different. At this point, Esther's going to take up the story, and she is going to tell you about the garden in detail, what the various things are and mean in the garden. So Esther, dear, it's all yours now to show it all.
I'm delighted you could come, and let's go look at the garden. There are several ways in which a Japanese garden is different from a European or an English garden. This isn't like Versailles, where you can stand on a beautiful great porch and look out over a gorgeous garden spread out before you. In a Japanese garden, there's a principle called seen and hidden. There's a Japanese word for that, it's miyakugura. And what it means is that from any point in the garden, you cannot see everything. You have to take a little stroll, and the garden gradually unfolds before you. When you design a stroll garden, you have to keep this constantly in mind. Therefore, we have a mountain here to hide what's behind it. At the right is a thread-leaf maple. It was planted just there to hide the upper waterfall, which you can't see when you stand at the gate. Another of the principles of a Japanese garden is borrowed scenery. If we were lucky enough, we'd have Mount Fujiyama in the background, and that would of course be, we would have designed our scenery around Fujiyama. However, what we do have, and we're fortunate in some ways, are maple, a cherry tree, and we're surrounded here almost as if our garden was in a maple forest. All of this belongs to the neighbors. Another principle that one must think of in designing a garden is that water and rocks are as important as foliage and planting. And the planting does not emphasize flowers. Flowers are used only for seasonal accent, and it's the texture, the variation in shades of green, the variation in size of plant that is important, that creates the spirit of a Japanese garden. I believe I told you that this was a Japanese stroll garden, but also a tea garden. And in a tea garden, there's always a water basin. The water basin is for ritual cleansing before the tea ceremony. It has, by tradition, a stone for a lantern, should you be coming out at night carrying a lantern to light it, a stone for the kettle, and also, of course, the water basin itself with a dipper. So what one does, the water is placed low so that you must have a gesture of humility before you go to the tea ceremony, which is a ritualistic and almost a spiritual experience. So you bend down and dip the water and rinse your hands. Also rinse out your mouth. The water falls into a little area of pebbles, which is called the sea. That ties this garden into the wider universe of nature. You may find, when you come to the tea ceremony, a twine or straw-wrapped rock like this one on a stepping stone in the path. You'll know then that the tea master is not ready for you. He's probably making his flower arrangement or boiling up his tea, and so then you would sit down very quietly on a waiting bench. After a bit, the tea master would come from the tea house, pick up the rock, bow to you to indicate that he is ready, and you would rise and follow him down the path quietly to the tea house. Perhaps you noticed this old snag, you might say, or this old piece of lilac here. We've left it purposely because this lilac is the oldest thing in our garden, and as you know, the Orientals and the Japanese particularly reverence old age. So this is our example of old age, something preserved from the past. Miko Grosvenor, Phil's niece-in-law, came to this garden and told us we should have a male principal and a female principal stone here. Therefore, we dubbed this our male principal stone, an erect stone that is somewhat dominating in its corner. This upper pool is our goldfish nursery. The pointed island here we call Crane Island. It's symbolic of happiness. This is our steeper waterfall, our larger waterfall, so that is considered a he waterfall by the Japanese. who seem to be very, have a patriarchal culture. The stone signpost here, I like to tell people, is so ancient that the Japanese characters have worn off of it. However, what it actually says is that you can go through the Torii gate to the Shinto temple beyond. That's through this way. Or else you can go ahead to the tea house. One of our visitors in the Secret Garden tour was absolutely astounded. He said, "You mean there's a Shinto temple on Farewell Street? I never knew that." After we'd finished the garden, I read in one of my books that you should always plan your watercourse from northeast to southwest. Fortunately, I had, because what that means is that you will have longevity, long life, happiness, good fortune, and certainly many grandchildren. Actually, we do have tea out here. I come out very often with my lunch or with a good book. Every Japanese garden has to have water. We're fortunate in that we have real water, but we also, in the dry creek bed and between the two pools and also in the outlet, we have a representation of water, and even more here in the dry garden, where you can see the raked lines around the various objects indicate the ripples that would be going, that you would find in a sea, and the straight lines represent calm water. This is one of the few artifacts that we have purchased, the snow lantern in the corner here of the dry garden. Its wide roof was designed particularly to catch the snow, and it is beautiful after a snowfall when you can see the snow on the roof. The snow viewing lantern is meant, the lantern isn't viewing the snow, it's for us to look at it. This is our female principal stone, and we didn't want her to be lonesome, so we gave her 2 cubs. Our upper falls is the he waterfall. This one, which is lower, is a she waterfall. It's a lower and more gentle waterfall. On the other hand, it does go into the major pool. I don't know whether the fish will come for their supper now because it's midday, but this is where we feed them, usually in the late afternoon. They should be voracious, but they haven't discovered yet that I'm giving them a meal. I'm sitting now appropriately on the stone of meditation. Across the water is the Buddha. I'm sure that as I meditate upon him, I guess the hope is that he is meditating upon me. In the pond between us is Turtle Island. It represents longevity. Our particular type of bamboo here, Cynoarendaria nitida, is considered to be the favorite food of the panda. We don't have any pandas yet in our garden, but maybe someday we will. Phil always speaks of this as Esther's garden, but actually we couldn't have had a garden without Phil because he's been so helpful. Phil really hates rocks. I regret to say this about someone who is a builder of a Japanese garden, and yet he has helped me haul pebbles from beach trips and big rocks from woodland walks. He also, we have together carried these sea-eroded cement blocks from Second Beach that we've turned into lanterns throughout the garden here. And on one heroic occasion, Phil, with our brick mason, rolled the big threshold, the huge rock that's in front of the Shinto gate. He helped take that on rollers over the empty hole that's now our goldfish nursery. We've traveled miles through Massachusetts looking for the perfect water basin and the right water pumps and the dearest goldfish, and also just the plants that we wanted for the garden. We're awfully glad you could come with us this afternoon, and I think we should give a big tribute to my co-partner in this venture, Philip.
Thank you, Esther. You've been much too generous in your appreciation of my small contributions. You really have. The fact is that a number of people have helped. The brick mason, for example, he did much more work than I did when it came to rolling that big stone. There's one, and a number of other people. I think we should say something about Mary Hines, who has loyally dug out that pool for you many times, getting the muck out of it, which has to be done in this pool as in any other. And she's been great. I'd like to mention one non-cooperator, however, and that's these goldfish. I suppose that a goldfish is different from a person in a good many different ways. These goldfish seem to have no sense of occasion. As soon as the camera appears, they duck in under the rock, which they're not supposed to do. But God made them and let them be in their own way, I suppose really as good as any goldfish in Japan. In talking of contributors, though, I think we should mention our friend Ned Sherman, who is right now pointing that camera at us and making this splendid film. He's done a good job. He's been the cameraman, the arranger, the orderer, and generally the impresario of this total thing. And Ned, Esther, and I are both very grateful to you indeed. Well, so this film is coming to an end, and we're doing it for our children and grandchildren. Do you all realize that we're really the first generation that has been able to make this easy and relatively inexpensive record of what our forefathers looked like? So if we're the forefathers, generations yet to come can get out this little thing and say that's the way they did it back in 1980 and 1990. And it's as if somebody now could dig up from the basement of the Gettysburg Courthouse an absolutely unknown, unexpected, crude film of Abraham Lincoln giving and sounding the Gettysburg Address. Wow, what a $1 million item that would be, and perhaps this film will never be quite at that level, but it may be as useful to our grandchildren. Well, now we must cease this chatter, I think, and walk off the scene across the little bridge. The bridge was incidentally built by our nephew, Richard Eberhard, and it's a very nice little job.